Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
On a chilly October morning, a group of high school juniors from a small rural town in Pennsylvania set out for a weekend field trip to an old mining museum nestled deep in the Allegheny Mountains. The museum had been shut down for years, but was recently reopened for historical tours. It was meant to be educational, an exploration of the lives and dangers faced by coal miners in the early 1900s. But for the 23 students and 2 teachers who went, it became something far more sinister. The bus ride was uneventful, filled with chatter and music. The road twisted through the mountains, the trees almost forming a tunnel as they ascended into fog and pine. When they arrived, the guide, a gaunt, quiet man named Mr. Ellery, met them at the entrance. He didn't say much beyond a warning. Stay with the group. These tunnels go deeper than you think. Some students laughed, assuming it was part of the act, but there was a weight in his tone that made a few glance at each other with unease. The tour began smoothly. They entered the mine through an arched steel door that groaned like a dying animal. The first few chambers were lit with electric lanterns showing rusted tools, collapsed carts, and water-stained walls. Mr. Ellery spoke of cave-ins, suffocation, and men who wandered too far down and were never seen again. That part wasn't on the brochure. About an hour into the tour, the group reached a fork, 2 tunnels, one lit and paved with rails, the other unlit and partially collapsed. Mr. Ellery stopped and turned, his face pale. "We won't go that way," he said, gesturing to the dark tunnel. "There's history down there best left alone." But then, in a split moment of distraction, a scream tore through the group. Everyone spun around to find that a girl, Kayla, was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just gone. They ran back down the corridor, calling her name, but the echo distorted their voices into something crueler, deeper. Mr. Ellery's face drained of color. "She didn't stay with the group," he muttered. "No one ever comes back when they do that." Panic erupted. One of the teachers demanded they return to the surface and call for help, but the radios weren't working. Mr. Ellery said the rock sometimes interfered with signals. He insisted they press forward. There was a ladder further in that led to a rescue shaft. They walked faster now. Shadows played tricks in the corners of their eyes. One student, Aaron, swore he saw someone standing just outside the edge of their light, deep in the mine, unmoving, staring. Another girl, Marcy, began sobbing, saying she could hear Kayla whispering her name from the walls. Then the light started to fail, first flickering, then dying completely in parts. Mr. Ellery's lantern sputtered but held. "Stay close," he barked, voice now shaky. "We're not alone in here." Something began following them, not walking, scraping, like nails on wet stone. Whenever they stopped, the noise stopped. When they moved, it resumed. Mr. Ellery finally snapped, dropping his lantern. He turned and screamed into the darkness. "She's not yours! Let them go!" Then he was yanked backward, as if a cable had been looped around his waist and pulled full force. They heard bones crack. Someone shrieked. The lantern clattered to the ground, still burning. Mr. Ellery was gone. Blind with fear, the group broke into a run, but the tunnels were different now. Doors they passed earlier were gone. Walls had shifted. Somehow, the mine had changed, like it was rearranging itself while they weren't looking. And all the while, that scraping continued. Hours passed, maybe more. Time lost all meaning in the blackness. One by one, students went missing. Some slipped through suddenly open cracks in the walls. Others simply stopped responding when their names were called. Only 6 eventually stumbled out into the night, faces streaked with grime and terror. Rescue crews scoured the mine for weeks. They found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of the others. Even the tunnel where they said Kayla disappeared was sealed with rock, looking as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The museum was shut down again, this time permanently. The survivors never returned to school. Some were institutionalized. One took his own life a year later. They never told the full story, only that something lived deep in the mine, something old, hungry, and bound to the dark. Something that waits for those who wander too far on field trips meant to be safe.
Story number 2.
In the spring of 2011, a middle school in Oregon organized a weekend camping field trip to the Cascade Forest for its 7th graders. The idea was to teach students about nature and survival skills. It was an annual tradition, and nothing had ever gone wrong until that year. There were 18 students, 2 teachers, and 3 parent chaperones. The group hiked 5 miles into a remote part of the forest and set up camp in a clearing near a creek. That night, after the fire had died down and the forest fell silent, one of the boys, Liam, woke up screaming in his tent. When the others rushed over, he was sitting up, wide-eyed, trembling. He said someone was inside his tent, whispering in a language he didn't understand. The adults dismissed it as a nightmare, but Liam refused to sleep in his tent again. He spent the rest of the night by the fire, staring into the woods. The next morning, everyone was tired, and the teachers decided to go ahead with the day's hike to a nearby ridge. Liam stayed behind with one of the chaperones, Mrs. Hayward, who offered to rest with him at camp. When the group returned 3 hours later, the camp was empty. Liam and Mrs. Hayward were gone, their backpacks still sitting on the log near the fire pit. There were no signs of a struggle, no prints leading away, just one strange thing. The tents had all been unzipped and flattened, like someone had intentionally stepped on them. The teachers tried the radios, but only static replied. It was getting dark fast, so they set up a temporary shelter and planned to hike back at first light. That night, around 2 a.m., the screaming started. It was faint at first, somewhere deep in the forest, but it was unmistakably a child's scream, raw and panicked. Several students swore it was Liam's voice. One of the teachers, Mr. Collier, grabbed a flashlight and ventured toward the sound, telling the group he'd be back. He never returned. The scream stopped less than a minute after he left. At sunrise, the group decided to pack up and head back. But the trail was different. Paths that had been clearly marked were gone, replaced by thick undergrowth. Tree carvings and ribbons they tied the day before had vanished. One of the students, Ella, pointed out something disturbing. The trees themselves looked different, like they had moved in the night. They wandered for hours. Then they found Mr. Collier's flashlight wedged into a hollow tree, still on, but with deep scratches running along its plastic casing. Near it was something even worse, a piece of his lanyard, torn and crusted with something dark brown. Panic spread. The group picked a direction and walked without stopping. Around dusk, they stumbled into a wide clearing none of them recognized, completely silent, not even birds. In the center was a single massive tree. Tied around its base with strips of red cloth were Liam's jacket, Mrs. Hayward's scarf, and Mr. Collier's ID badge. Nailed into the bark was a handwritten note made of ripped notebook paper and written in a child's handwriting. It read, "You shouldn't have come back." They ran. No one stopped for water. No one dared speak. When they finally emerged from the forest the next morning, exhausted, dehydrated, crying, they flagged down a ranger on patrol. The authorities launched a massive search operation. They found nothing, not a single trace of the missing 3. The strange tree couldn't be located again, and none of the photos from the students' phones that weekend would open. Every image file was corrupted. The district permanently canceled the camping trips after that. Rumors still swirl in the town about that stretch of forest. Locals say it's cursed, that something ancient and territorial lives deep inside, something that doesn't forget or forgive. And every so often, hikers still report hearing a child scream in the distance, echoing through the trees.
Story number 3.
In 2009, a small private school in northern Michigan arranged a field trip to an old coal mine that had been converted into a museum. It was meant to be an educational experience. History, geology, a bit of adventure. The mine was deep in the woods, a solid 2-hour bus ride from town, with no cell service and only one ranger station within miles. The mine, called Raven Rock, had a history most of the students didn't know until they were already there. Over 70 miners had died in a collapse in 1913. Their bodies never recovered. According to local legend, some workers swore they still heard voices in the lower tunnels, voices calling for help, or sometimes whispering the names of the living. The tour started off well enough. They were fitted with helmets and headlamps, led by an old man named Carl, who had worked the museum for decades. He was serious, stern, and spoke like he didn't really want to be there. "Stick to the main tunnel," he warned. "You go off the path, you don't come back." As the group descended deeper, the air grew colder and heavier. The mine walls narrowed, and the only light came from their headlamps. Carl showed them old mining tools, tracks for ore carts, even a small underground lake said to be over 200 feet deep. That's when one of the students, Jared, noticed something odd in the water, ripples, even though no one had touched it. He mentioned it to Carl, who went completely still. "Don't speak to it," Carl muttered. "It hears better down here." The group laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the act. But then one of the teachers, Ms. Delaney, pointed out that Jared was gone. They retraced their steps quickly. Nothing. No footprints, no sound, just the slow, echoing drip of water and the increasingly oppressive silence. Carl was visibly shaken. "We're leaving. Now!" As they hurried back, their headlamps began to flicker. One went out, then another. Whispers filled the dark, not from ahead or behind, right beside them. Close. Too close. One girl, Emily, swore something brushed her arm. When she turned, she saw a figure walking silently beside her. Not a student, not Carl. Just a man in soaked, filthy mining gear, his face blackened with soot, eyes blank and wide as if frozen in his last terrified moment. They burst into the entrance chamber, panicked, breathless. Jared was there, standing perfectly still, facing the wall. He was soaking wet. When they spoke to him, he didn't respond, just kept whispering to himself in a low, rasping voice. The only words anyone could make out were, "It's under the lake, it's still digging." The school immediately contacted emergency services. Jared was taken to the hospital and treated for severe hypothermia, but he had no memory of the trip. Not of the mine, not of going missing, not of the whispers. 3 weeks later, Carl quit his job without warning. Before he left, he sent an email to the school. It was short, just one sentence. That mine never stopped claiming people. Raven Rock was shut down the following year after another incident, this time involving a family on a weekend tour. 2 children went missing in the lower tunnel. Their bodies were never recovered. Today, the entrance is welded shut, but hikers still report hearing tapping from beneath the earth, like someone knocking on stone with bare fingers. And some say if you stand near the old mine at dusk, you'll hear your name echoing up from the deep, even if no one else is with you.
Story number 4.
In 2004, a high school from Ohio organized a field trip to visit a now-defunct psychiatric hospital that had recently been converted into a historical landmark. The students were told they'd be learning about outdated treatments and the evolution of mental health care. What they weren't told, at least not officially, was that the hospital had been abruptly shut down in 1972 after a string of patient disappearances and the mysterious death of its last director, Dr. Adrian Kepler, who was found hanging in his office with the words, "I let it out," carved into the wall behind him. The building itself was a towering, Gothic-style nightmare. Ivy strangled the stone walls, windows were sealed with metal grates, and the air smelled like mildew and old medicine. 30 students and 2 teachers entered through the front, led by a young, overly chipper tour guide named Riley. Inside, the hospital was colder than it should have been. Students made jokes, took pictures, and laughed nervously. But everyone quieted when they reached the basement, where patients with severe issues had once been kept. The air grew heavy. Lights flickered. Riley smiled a little too hard as she mentioned that the hospital was known for its underground isolation rooms, soundproof and windowless. One of the students, Grace, lagged behind, staring into a rusted cell. She said she saw someone inside, facing the wall, muttering. Riley brushed it off. Sometimes old pipes sound like voices, but Grace was pale and wouldn't stop glancing over her shoulder. Then it started. A student named Marcus screamed. Everyone turned to find him standing frozen, pointing at the hallway they had just walked down. "There was someone behind us," he whispered. "I saw them. No eyes." The group laughed it off nervously until they tried to leave and found the stairwell door stuck. Riley frowned and jiggled the handle, then used a walkie-talkie to call for help, but all they got was static. As minutes dragged into an hour, the students grew restless. A few joked about being trapped in a horror movie. That's when the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed the basement. Some kids turned on their phone flashlights, only to find the hallway behind them was no longer empty. A man was standing at the far end, tall, thin, wearing a patient's gown, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. He didn't move, just stood and stared. Then he was gone. Panic broke out. They pounded on the doors, screamed for help. Grace fainted. Riley began to cry, whispering, "This didn't happen last time." Then she admitted she wasn't a real guide. She was a college student who volunteered part-time. She didn't know how to get out. The real guide hadn't shown up that morning, so she faked it. One of the teachers, Mr. Langford, took control and led the group back toward the central hallway, trying to retrace their steps. But the building didn't match anymore. New hallways stretched where there were none before. Doors opened into empty stairwells that descended into black. One student, Ava, peeked into a room and saw dozens of wheelchairs all facing the same direction, as if an audience had been frozen in place. She swore she saw one slowly turning to face her. Then they found the old therapy room. At the center was a rusted electroshock table still strapped down. The nameplate beside it read Dr. Adrian Kepler. On the walls were deep gouges, like fingernails had clawed at them endlessly. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut and locked. A low humming filled the room, the old machines flickering to life for the first time in decades. And then, in the corner of the room where there had been nothing, stood the man again. Head cocked, no eyes, just smooth, scarred skin where they should have been. He lifted a finger and pointed at Grace, who began to scream uncontrollably. When the maintenance team finally opened the building 4 hours later, they found the group huddled together in the entrance hall. Everyone was accounted for, except Grace. They found her phone inside one of the isolation rooms, still recording. The last seconds of the video showed her face, pale and trembling, whispering, "It won't let me out. It only wanted me." The hospital was shuttered for good after that. Boarding was placed over every door and no field trip has returned since. But locals say sometimes at night they see a girl's silhouette in one of the basement windows, screaming silently through the glass.